This debate every Tuesday afternoon. Kia ora.
Mr. Speaker.
Honourable David Clayton Cosgrove. Sorry.
Look, that was an outstanding contribution from Mr. Coleman. Who is Mr. Minister Coleman? Well, which doctor perhaps, we're not sure. But he was part of that great duo, you know, sort of Laurel and Hardy, you know, Maurice Williamson and Dr. Coleman, who were such geniuses in the national government that they couldn't make a basic process decision that was not reviewable by a court. And it took a court in this land to come down on them like a ton of the proverbial and require them to readdress this decision and to use a proper process. But if you look at Dr. Coleman's contribution around here and his political track record, they don't call him the maestro for nothing, both inside and outside this place. I say to the prospective next Speaker of the House and the next Knight of the Realm, Sir Maurice Williamson, he could have picked a better partner, I think, in crime, as it were, to deal with this decision. But let me say this. One of the things that Dr. Coleman said as he concluded his speech was he said that this is yesterday's issue. That's what he said. And he also said, and I quote from him, people do not care about this. Well, I say this to Dr. Coleman. I don't know what planet he's on. I don't know what stratosphere he's orbiting. I don't know if he reads the newspaper every day. But when it comes to assets being sold, whether they be land-based assets or whether they be state-owned assets, then I got to tell him, and I'm sure Maurice Williamson, who is I think still Minister of Statistics, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, who can count on using all his fingers and toes, will tell Dr. Coleman that if he reads a poll that 80% of New Zealanders think these issues of asset sales are paramount in their minds and paramount to their lives. 80% are, for instance, opposed to the government's fire sale of state-owned assets. So that proves how out of touch the maestro is. According to the great maestro, no one cares about these issues. No one cares about them. They are yesterday's issues. Well, I say to him, what do the polls say? Well, I just said to the member, 80% of New Zealanders consistently, to that member whose name I can't recall, but somebody will help me out, Mr. McClay will, Mr. Simpson, 80% of New Zealanders consistently across the board. See, if you're going to ask the question, Mr. Simpson, you're a new member, you've got to have the facts up the old sleeve. 80% of New Zealanders consistently in the polls, Mr. Simpson, have said they are opposed to the sale of state-owned assets which they already own. And when you ask New Zealanders about whether they wish to sell out land holus bolus, then I suspect a similar number would line up in a similar queue. Now, the National Party's made a case, and they've read out all sorts of figures about what we did, the usual sort of time trap governments get into, nearly 4 years in, when they don't want to address their own mistakes, their own myopic behaviour, their own stuff-ups, then it's what did the other side do, because they don't want to talk about their own conduct. But let's say this, that yes, and Maurice Williamson I think addressed it in his speech, that yes, there is something called policy evolution, called learning. Governments do things of all shades. Governments do things with the best of intention normally. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they believe it's right, until they actually look back in history and say perhaps there is a different or a better way. And yes, the government of which I was a part of did sell land. But I say to this government, we have learned there is a private member's bill in David Shearer's name, which does not prevent, you see, there they go again. A party that does not evolve, does not listen to the communities, does not learn from history, is doomed, sir, and these people are doomed. And the bill that is in David Shearer's name, as they sort of squawk, cue ball down in the corner there, as they sort of squawk, the private member's bill in David Shearer's name is actually enlightened, because at its very essence, what it says is it does not prevent foreign investment, it is not anti-foreign investment, It is not anti the purchase of in a limited way certain land stocks, but what it says is if you're going to do a Crafar Farms deal and you are a foreign investor, then you have to come to the table with something called value add.
Do it for the good of New Zealand.
You have to have something that you offer New Zealand, my colleague is right, for the good of New Zealand, not just have a grandiose auction and flog it off just for the sake of it, because at their very core, the National Party has a fundamental belief that, they believe, God-given right to flog everything off, normally to foreign investors, as we saw with Contact Energy. That is their absolute fundamental bedrock belief. That's what they think. Sell it off. And what we're finding now as we unpack the so-called Mighty River sale, for instance, is this, I believe, will go down in history as one of the biggest wealth transfers, where those who can't scrape up that $1,000 or $2,000 to get in on the deal will pay for all those who can, of course, and they'll pay in the bonus shares, the loyalty bonus, which the national government said we wouldn't need because New Zealand would own these shares into the future infinitum. But we now know that's rubbish, that's bunkum, because they want to have a loyalty share scheme. So this is about wealth transfer, and this is about the National Party not evolving. The National Party not learning from its own history. The salamanders, as my colleague who has some degree of expertise looking across the other side of reptiles, Mr. Little has given me a brief. They are a pack of salamanders, these people. And I say this, they would do well to have a look at that private members bill, because what it basically requires is foreign investment to deliver benefits that would be over and above what a New Zealand investor could produce. So you look at your Kiwis and you say, well, if it's going to go, then the foreign investor has to come in and say, we can provide something that your domestic arrangements and your domestic investors cannot provide. That may be, for instance, international and overseas trade linkages. That may be expertise that we don't have. It may be, for instance, that I offer to transfer technology or expertise into the New Zealand marketplace. What it means at its very essence is that this has got to be about something bigger and better for our country. It could be, for instance, real job creation, not just picking off a few people around the edges to make it look like you've created a few jobs. It could be doing something innovative that perhaps is not possible in New Zealand, but all those things are about adding value and substantial value, like increasing exports, like job creation, other important factors, adding value to this country. But the National Party's view is flog it off at whatever cost. And the evidence of that, if you go back to state-owned enterprises, is you have Mighty River Power with a treaty tribunal inquiry hanging over the sale, with likely and potential court action going to possibly delay, Mr. Speaker, the sale. And the National Party simply, in the worst economic conditions of our time, to sell an asset, is hell-bent on just going for it, putting pressure on the treaty tribunal to say we just want to flog this thing off, because this, for the National Party, is about a flag in the ground on their political philosophy. It's not about New Zealand. It's about the Prime Minister's pride now, because the Prime Minister and the National Party have wrapped their arms, pot-riveted themselves, welded themselves to this policy, in the face of massive opposition up and down the country, in the face of economists and experts criticising the legislation they put through. So now it's simply about John Key's old-fashioned pride that he wants to get this through because he refuses to see sense and back down. But it's also about their ideology. You know, flogging revenue-generating assets that create millions and millions and millions of dollars for our communities, millions of dollars over and above the debt servicing costs of their $300 million a week borrowings for a reckless tax cut. And who in their right mind, looking at that proposition, where we know you're going to lose $100 million in dividends a year, lose to the taxpayer, would agree to that. But this is about the old-fashioned pride and prejudice to some extent of John Key and the National Party. The Lord above could come down and say this is not a good deal, I can see into the future, we're going to lose, the taxpayers are going to lose, and John Key and the National Party would say, no, we don't care, we are going to do it, and they will if they're not stopped in their tracks. And how do we know that this sort of behaviour doesn't work? Because those geniuses tried it last time in the Bolger government, and are we any better off? No. And this is part of it. If you're going to sell something and flog it off overseas, the deal is there has to be a value add for New Zealand, not about fixing John Key's political predicament and his pride.
Todd McClay.
Speaker, the court found that the minister acted within the powers of the law.